Let me ask you a question. What do you call someone who switches sides in the middle of a war to join up with the enemy? I suppose it all depends on whether he's joining your side or joining the other side. But if someone leaves your enemy and joins up with your side, that's not such a bad thing. But if someone leaves your side and joins up with the enemy, well, we've got names for that, like turncoat and traitor. And the person who immediately comes to mind when we hear that word traitor is Benedict Arnold. In the Revolutionary War, Benedict Arnold was one of our finest generals, but he didn't receive a promotion that he thought he deserved, and he got into financial trouble, and he ended up switching sides, sharing military intelligence with the British. And now his name is synonymous with being a traitor. I told you last week that we were going to learn today about someone who switched sides in the war between Israel and Judah. But first, let's do just a little bit of review. King Saul was the first king of Israel. And while he was reigning, the young man David was chosen by God to become the next king of Israel. But David spent about 15 years being chased by King Saul, who wanted to kill him, until eventually King Saul himself died in battle with the Philistines, and David was then anointed as king over the tribe of Judah. Now, God intended David to be the king over all of Israel, but at the beginning, only that one tribe was ready to receive him. And we saw last week that when Saul died, one of his sons, Ishbosheth, took the throne over all the rest of the tribes to the north. Ishbosheth's forces were led by a man named Abner. And we need to remember that Abner was the one who actually put Ishbosheth on the throne. He's the one that made that happen. And so at this point in the story, we have two kings, one anointed by God, the other anointed by Abner. Meanwhile, in Judah, David's forces were led by a man named Joab. And there was this civil war between the north and the south. The armies of Joab and Abner engaged in battle, and Joab's army won an overwhelming victory. One of their few losses was the death of Joab's brother, Asahel, whom Abner killed in self-defense. And in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 6, we read, "As the war between the house of Saul and the house of David went on, Abner became a powerful leader among those loyal to Saul." Now, it seems apparent that Abner put Ishbosheth on the throne because he was a weak man that Abner could control, so that he could be the real power behind the throne. And it worked. And as time went on, Abner grew in his strength and his influence over those northern tribes, which would have been a good thing for Abner, except for one thing. And we read this verse when we left off last week. That was the beginning of a long war between those who were loyal to Saul and those loyal to David. As time passed, David became stronger and stronger, while Saul's dynasty became weaker and weaker. And so Abner was becoming more and more important in the kingdom that was becoming weaker and weaker. And rising to the top in a house that's going down is not a position that anyone wants to be in. Now, at this point, we read about a major falling out between Abner and Ishbosheth. One day, Ishbosheth, Saul's son, accused Abner of sleeping with one of his father's concubines, a woman named Rizpah, daughter of Aiah. Now, let me just explain a little bit about concubines. Concubines were like wives, but with fewer rights. A concubine was sort of a cross between a wife and a servant. And it wasn't uncommon for a king in that day to have many concubines who formed his royal harem. So taking a royal concubine wasn't just a matter of sexual immorality, it was an act of treason. Taking a former king's concubine was a public way of laying claim to the throne itself. Well, Abner was the commander of the king's army. But as he got more and more powerful, it's obvious that Abner wanted to be the king. And so he made his move. He did something that took him one step closer to the throne. And when he did, Ishbosheth challenged him. We read in 2 Samuel chapter 3, verse 7, he says, "Why did you sleep with my father's concubine?" Now, Abner was not a man who liked to be challenged, especially by Ishbosheth, who was a weak man who was completely dependent upon Abner's strength to keep him in power. So it says, Abner was furious. "Am I some Judean dog to be kicked around like this?" he shouted. "After all I've done for your father Saul and his family and his friends by not handing you over to David, is this my reward, that you find fault with me about this woman?" Abner says, "How dare you question me after all I've done for you? The only reason you're king is because I'm the one who put you there. I'm the one who put you on that throne. I could have turned you over to David, but no, I made you king, and now you want to tell me what I can and cannot do?" And then he goes on to say, he says, "May God strike me and even kill me if I don't do everything I can to help David get what the Lord has promised him. I'm going to take Saul's kingdom and give it to David. I will establish the throne of David over Israel as well as Judah, all the way from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south." Abner says, basically here, he says, I'm going to switch sides. I'm going to switch sides and I'm going to join up with David, and then I'm going to take your kingdom and I'm going to give it to him so that he can rule over all of it. And you'll be left with absolutely nothing. Let's see how you like that. Well, after Abner finished ranting and raving, we read that Ishbosheth didn't dare say another word because he was afraid of what Abner might do. Which I think tells you what a weak man Ishbosheth was and what an intimidating man Abner was. Now, I think Abner had been considering switching sides long before this. This just gave him a good excuse. Remember that I said Abner was getting stronger and stronger in a kingdom that was getting weaker and weaker, that was going down. And what good would it be for him to become a king in a kingdom whose days are numbered? And so Abner was the kind of guy who liked to be on the winning side. And it was obvious to him that David's side was eventually going to win, especially since, as Abner noted, God had promised that. And so that's what Abner does. He switches sides. And verse 12 reads, "Then Abner sent messengers to David saying, 'Doesn't the entire land belong to you? Make a solemn pact with me, and I will help turn over all of Israel to you.'" Abner offers his support to David, and he pledges to bring all of the tribes of Israel with him. He says, "You want to be king over all of Israel? That's what God promised you, and I'm a man that can make that happen. I can make your kingdom, and I can take your kingdom to the next level. Let's work together, and I'll make you the king that you want to be." Now, David didn't accept his offer right away, but he didn't reject him either. Verse 13 reads, "All right," David replied, "but I will not negotiate with you unless you bring back my wife, Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come." Now, Michal was the daughter of King Saul, and at one time she was David's wife. In fact, she was his first wife. But when David had to run away from Saul, Saul gave her to another man. That was a cruel thing for Saul to do, and David was determined to get her back. Now, it's hard to say whether this was politically motivated or whether David wanted her back because he loved her so much and he missed her. I happen to think it was probably the latter. I mean, this was David's first love who had been taken away from him. But Michal had been married to someone else for at least 10 years now. And so how cruel it was for David to tear that family apart just so he could have Michal back in his life. And it's hard to read this story without feeling some sympathy for her second husband, Palti, who clearly loved Michal and was devastated when she was taken away. Verse 15 reads, So Ishbosheth took Michal away from her husband, Palti, son of Laish. Palti followed along behind her as far as Bahurim, weeping as he went. Then Abner told him, Go back home. So Palti returned. And I can't imagine the pain and the heartache that must have caused. But the scene quickly switches to Abner. Now that he had met David's condition, it was time to get down to business. Abner had to make sure that he could follow through on his promise, that he could get all of the northern tribes to switch sides. And so it says, Meanwhile, Abner had consulted with the elders of Israel. For some time now, he told them, You have wanted to make David your king. Now is the time. For the Lord has said, I have chosen David to save my people Israel from the hands of the Philistines and from all of their enemies. Abner also spoke with the men of Benjamin. And what's interesting here is that apparently the leaders of these 11 tribes had been considering making David their king for some time now. So who was it that stood in the way of God's people being united? It was Abner. I mean, if it hadn't been for him, Ishbosheth would have never been king. And it seems very clear that most of the people in Israel wanted David as their king. Charles Spurgeon was a prominent preacher in the late 1800s, and he preached a sermon on this text, and the title of the sermon was, Now Then, Do It. And here was his premise in the sermon. He said, here you have the people of Israel for a long time thinking that they want to have David as their king, talking about having David as their king, maybe even planning one day to have David as their king, but they never actually take David as their king. They never crown him as their king. And Spurgeon said, in the same way, some of you have thought about making Jesus king of your life. You've talked about making Jesus as the king of your life, and you've done everything but actually make Jesus the king of your life. And what he said in that sermon was, you need to just do it. Just do it. And then, of course, Nike comes along and steals his slogan, right? But Spurgeon said it first. You thought about making Jesus the king of your life? Well, just do it. What are you waiting for? And so Abner talked to all of these leaders about switching sides, and he especially spent time talking with the men of Benjamin, because that was the tribe that King Saul was from. That's where all his family and friends were. And so it would have taken a little more persuasion to get them to switch sides. But eventually Abner was able to get everyone to agree, and so he went down to Hebron to meet with David. Now, what I want you to see here is that Abner was always doing whatever was best for him. I mean, when it was in his best interest to make Ishbosheth king, he made Ishbosheth king. And when the tide was turning in the direction of David, Abner went over to David. Verse 19 says, Then he went to Hebron to tell David that all the people of Israel and Benjamin had agreed to support him. And David received Abner with open arms. When Abner and 20 of his men came to Hebron, David entertained them with a great feast. When Abner talked with David, he could have said something like, David, I know that God has anointed you as king, and you know that I've been fighting against you, but today I repent of my actions, and I lay down my sword, and I offer myself as your servant. But that's not the approach that Abner took. Then Abner said to David, Let me go and call an assembly of all Israel to support my lord the king, and they will make a covenant with you to make you their king, and you will rule over everything your heart desires. And do you see what Abner's doing here? he's saying, hey, I made Ishbosheth king, and I can make you the king over all that your heart desires. I'm the kingmaker, David, and I can do some great things for you. But here are a couple of problems with Abner's offer. First off, Abner attempted to take God's place. God is the one who promised to give the kingdom to David. And so when Abner says, I will gather all of Israel so that you may reign, he's trying to take God's place, as if the throne of David depended upon Abner putting him on it. You know, it's hard for me not to think of the third temptation that Satan brought to Jesus when he was there in the wilderness, when he showed him all of the kingdoms of the world and said, hey, all of these kingdoms I will give you if you'll just fall down and worship me. And I would say to you, beware of anyone who promises to give you the desires of your heart, because God is the only one who can give us what we truly need. And the reason you need to be careful of anyone who promises to give you what you really want is because they probably have some hidden motives. In this case, Abner wanted to control David. Abner said to David, hey, make a covenant with me. Connect yourself to me. I will be your path to success, David. If Abner had gotten his way, he would have turned David into another Ishbosheth, just a puppet king under Abner's control. Abner promised to give David what his heart desired, but the truth is, Abner wanted to control David. And so beware of people who promise to give you what you really want, because they probably have some hidden motives. Now we see David's response to Abner's offer. He doesn't reject it, but he doesn't accept it either. It appears that David wanted to, take some time to think it over and maybe even consult God about what he should do. And in verse 21 it says, so David sent Abner safely on his way. And I wonder if David thought about what Abner said to him when he wrote Psalm 37 years later, and he said, trust in the Lord and do good. Take delight in the Lord, and He will give you your heart's desires. Abner came to David and said, hey, I'll give you all your heart desires. But David later says, here's what I found. If you'll delight yourself in the Lord, He will give you the desires of your heart. And so David sent Abner on his way, and then we see what happens next. Joab, the commander of David's army, had been out on a raid when Abner came to visit. And when Joab returned home and learned that David had received Abner with grace, Joab was furious. He went to the king and he said, what have you done? What do you mean by letting Abner get away? You know perfectly well that he came to spy on you and find out everything you're doing. And Joab was convinced that Abner was a spy working for the enemy. And so he decided to take things into his own hands. And he sent messengers after Abner, probably in David's name, calling on Abner to come back to Hebron. Now David knew nothing about this. Joab did all of this behind his back. But it's obvious that Joab hated Abner. And I think there are several reasons for that. First of all, Abner killed his brother Asahel, and so there's this blood feud between them. You killed my brother. You deserve to die. And then secondly, Abner is the rival commander. And Joab may be thinking, my job's at stake here. I'm about to be replaced by someone who has far more experience than I do. Abner was not only Ishbosheth's commander, but he was Saul's commander before that. And David was sort of groomed under him. They had a long relationship. And so maybe Joab's thinking, hey, I'm about to be replaced. Or maybe, just knowing the character of Abner, Joab knew that he was up to no good. I mean, there's no way he wants to do what's right. And so he's got some trick up his sleeve, and we're not going to fall for that. And so when Abner came back to Hebron, Joab took him aside at the gateway as if to speak to him privately. But then he stabbed Abner in the stomach and killed him in revenge for killing his brother Asahel. I mean, this was a brutal revenge killing, a cold-blooded murder committed by the man who holds the highest position in the land, the commander of David's armies. Well, immediately, David made it clear in verse 28, I vow by the Lord that I and my kingdom are forever innocent of this crime against Abner, son of Ner. Joab and his family are the guilty ones. And then David mourned the death of Abner. It says they buried Abner in Hebron, and the king and all the people wept at his graveside. Now, Abner had been a thorn in David's side for years, but when he died this brutal death, David grieved for him. And so everyone in Judah and all Israel understood that David was not responsible for Abner's murder. The only thing that David didn't do that he probably should have done was to punish Joab. His failure to exercise justice was a decision that David came to regret. And it remained on his conscience for the rest of his life. I mean, years later, when David was about to die, he gave instructions to Solomon, his son, and he told him to follow the Lord. And then he said, and you need to deal with Joab because of what he did to Abner. I never dealt with that, he said, and I didn't have the courage to do what needed to be done, and you need to do what's right. Now, why didn't David execute justice? Well, we're not told. Maybe David thought, I showed grace to Abner, so how can I bring justice now to Joab? But Abner killed Asahel in self-defense. Joab killed Abner in a brutal act of aggression. I mean, there's really no comparison. Or maybe David didn't feel strong enough to deal with this difficult responsibility. I mean, Joab was a powerful ally, and maybe there was part of him that felt that he couldn't survive without having Joab by his side. In verse 39, David says, even though I am the anointed king, these two sons of Zeruiah, Joab and Abishai, are too strong for me to control. Whatever the reason, Joab's murder of Abner left a stain on David's kingdom. Justice was not done, and it remained on David's conscience for the rest of his life. But the application that I want to focus on this morning really has to do with the shifting allegiance of Abner. Abner had been loyal to King Saul, commanding his armies. And then when King Saul died, Abner was loyal to Saul's son, Ishbosheth. He put Ishbosheth on the throne and he commanded his armies. But then when he had a falling out with Ishbosheth, Abner said, hey, I'm going to change sides. I'm going to end this civil war and make David the king over all of the kingdom. And throughout Abner's life, he seemed to change his allegiance. First it was Saul, and then it was Ishbosheth, and then it was David. But the reality is, Abner never really changed sides. As I said earlier, Abner was always doing what was best for Abner. When it was in his best interest to make Ishbosheth king, he made Ishbosheth king. And when the tide was turning in the direction of David, Abner went over to David. Abner even tried to pretend that he was on God's side. David, I know this is what God has promised you. Let me make it happen. And behind all of those shifts, Abner's real allegiance was to himself. He supported whatever king would benefit him the most. He used God's promises when the promise was convenient and benefited him. Abner was amazingly consistent his entire life in that his allegiance to himself never changed. And so this morning, I ask you to consider this question. Where does your allegiance lie? Now, I'm confident that if I was right there with you wherever you are and ask you, where is your allegiance? Without a doubt, you'd probably say, my allegiance is with God. God is my king and I serve him. But is it possible that our true allegiance is to ourselves? Do we serve God because we recognize he is the sovereign Lord, or because we think it's in our best interest? Are we always willing to do what God says because we have fully surrendered to him? Or are there pieces of our lives that we hold back because there are times that I want to do what I want to do? Years ago, I heard an illustration that went something like this. There was a farmer who asked his son to do 4 things for him. He said, son, I want you to plant corn in field number 1. I want you to plant wheat in field number 2, potatoes in field number 3, and I want you to plant beans in field number 4. And so the son, he went to work. He came to field number 1 and he said, Dad said plant corn here. I think that's a good idea. So he planted corn. He came to field number 2 and he said, Dad said to plant wheat here. That sounds like a pretty good idea. So he planted wheat. He came to field number 3 and he said, Dad said to plant potatoes here. Pretty good idea. And so he planted potatoes. But then he came to field number 4 and he said, I know Dad said to plant beans in field number 4, but I don't think that's such a good idea. I think watermelons would grow better here. And so he planted watermelons in field number 4. Now the question is this: how often did the son do what his father wanted him to do? Well, it would seem like the answer is he obeyed his father 75% of the time, 3 out of 4. But the correct answer is this: the son didn't obey his father at all. The only reason he did what his father said with those first 3 fields, the first 3 times, is because he agreed with his father. Every single time the son did what he thought was best, not what his father told him to do. And you know what? The same thing can happen in our relationship with God. God says don't steal, and we think, yeah, that seems like a pretty good idea, so I'm not going to steal. And God says don't murder, and we think, well, that seems like a good idea, so we don't murder. God says don't commit adultery, and we think that seems like a good idea, so we don't commit adultery. And then God says, love your enemy and forgive him. And we think, well, I'm not going to do that. Well, how much have we obeyed God? Oh, we may think we've obeyed God most of the time, but the truth is we didn't obey him at all. We always did what we wanted to do. It just so happens that we agreed with God most of the time. And so, where does your allegiance lie? When it comes down to choosing between what God tells you to do and what you want to do, which do you choose? To those whose allegiance is with God, you see, the choice is already made. We will always do what God says, whether it's easy or whether it's hard, whether it benefits us or whether it seems to make life more difficult for us. Because that's what true allegiance is all about.